the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast. Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by Lee Ohanian. Lee is one of the most astute writers and commentators on the topics of California public policy. He is a professor of economics at UCLA and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, and which I highly recommend reading some of his writings posted there. He is also an advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Lee, thank you so much for being on with me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I'm glad to join you.
Absolutely. So talk about California, a subject you're intimately familiar with. We have 367,000 people who have left this year alone from California, or 2021. About 1 million people net over the last decade. LA Times poll recently came out. 54% say the state is headed down the wrong path. The majority, around the same number, 53%, are considering leaving, including 63% of millennials. So much for representing the interests of the young. The vast majority want to leave. Obviously, a lot of this, almost all of it, due to economics. The California ranks 49th out of 50 in terms of income equality, and that's measured by the Gini coefficient. Then you add to that a bunch of other factors, which we'll get into, like being the most expensive place to live, having some of the most anti-business regulations in the country, failing schools, substantial increase in crime. So why is it that the most progressive place in the country that and the people who run this state see themselves as representing the interests of the middle class, of the working class, of the young? How have they created some of the worst outcomes in the country for those very demographics?
Right. It's, California now represents a very, very sad story, in my opinion. And my perspective is one from being a kid who grew up in California in the 1960s and 1970s. And I worked in California after I got a college degree. And then I went away for a while. I left California in 1988. So I lived in California, grew up in the 60s and 70s, worked until 1988. And I was gone for 11 years. I got a PhD in economics. And my first teaching job was at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I taught at the University of Minnesota before coming back in 99 to teach economics at UCLA. And in those 11 years, the California I saw between the time I left and the time I came back was recognizable, but very, very different. And today, after having lived in California another 22 years, California today is really unrecognizable from what I was used to growing up as a kid. So, for my friends and I as kids, it seemed like everything was possible. It seemed like anything was possible. Anybody could make it in California. It seemed like the sky was the limit. And now, particularly for young people, so you mentioned millennials are, almost 2 out of 3 millennials are thinking of leaving. And I can certainly understand why. California is incredibly expensive to live in. It's really the most expensive state in the country to live in. Hawaii might technically be more expensive, but Hawaii is a bit of a one-off because of just the way it is. But California is just remarkably expensive. And when, for example, millennials are thinking about moving, they're looking at a median home price of over $800,000 within the state. And if you combine that with the idea that if they're saying, hey, I want to be where the high-paying jobs are, so Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Los Angeles area, San Diego, essentially what we would call coastal California. And if they're thinking big and saying, you know what, I'm going to have a family, I'm going to have a couple of kids, and I'm going to have that, California dream, that median price home along the California coast is probably closer to 1.5, 1.8 million. Right. And so just think about what's involved in terms of landing that fish in the boat. 20% down payment on a home that size is $350,000. I mean, how many 25, 30-year-olds have that, or even have their parents or grandparents have access to that? And then when you're thinking about qualifying for a mortgage, a conventional mortgage on that, and now mortgage rates are up to about 4.5%, so they more than doubled They've more than doubled in just the last 2 or 3 months. There's just really a very small number of people who can swing that, who even can think about swinging that. So it's not all surprising people are thinking about leaving, because it is, for a lot of people, it's just untenable. And they don't want to think about continuing to live in a 400 square foot, one bedroom apartment in a dicey neighborhood. They want to go off and start their lives. And you look at places where Californians are moving to: Idaho, Wyoming, Texas, Tennessee. You can, some of these areas, instead of needing 1.5 million to get a decent home, 300,000 buys you a really, really nice home in some of these areas. Property taxes are lower. Other aspects of the quality of life, which we'll get into, are better. And it's really a situation where, as a lifelong Californian, except for for about 11-year period when I was gone, it's just night and day different, and it's not like the ocean liner is turning around and heading in the right direction to resolve and address these problems. These are all policy problems, and in terms of the folks who are listening, there's a tendency among people in California, and among a sales pitch that politicians give. This is really a political problem. It's a problem with political leadership. People think that, God, yeah, it's expensive to live here, and yeah, look at, the house down the street just sold for $1 million. Who would have thought that? Well, what can you do? Well, it's
Right.
not what you can do. What can you do? It's not like the weather. But people think it's like the weather.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do about it. Politicians sell a vision that it's like the weather. There's nothing you can do about it. But the quality of schooling, the quality of roads, the fact that we don't have enough water, the fact that it's so expensive to live here, the fact that crime has come to the point where people are often scared to go outside, those are all policy problems that can be addressed, and the needle can be moved substantially with the right policy changes. But sadly, we now have political leadership that is very different. Again, I'll just go back to my little allegory about, like, when I was growing up as a kid, the political, which was a Democratic governor, Pat Brown, bipartisanship in the state Senate and Assembly. But what passes for politics today would have never been tolerated under Democratic Governor Pat Brown. I've written, some things I've written about. Pat Brown, in his budget statements, has made statements such as, "We thank the taxpayer. We use their precious tax dollars in the most efficient way, and we can honestly say when we go to bed at night that they are getting a return on their investment in schools and bridges and hospitals and colleges and state highways that is at the same rate or higher than they're getting on their private investments." Today, the column I wrote this week was about Governor Newsom, saying, "Hey, we spent almost $13 billion on homelessness in the last 2 years. Isn't this great?" Well, homelessness got 7% worse during this period.
Right.
That performance would have been just unacceptable under the Democratic leadership at that time. There would have been accountability. People who would be involved in that process would no longer be involved in that process. The idea would be, you just burned up $13 million.
Right.
You didn't move the needle. You know what? You're out of this job. We're going to find somebody who can do the job. And that's simply not the case anymore. We don't have accountable politicians, and this really comes, voters have to demand for accountability. They have to demand, where are my tax dollars going? They have to ask, why is there still that pothole in the road and it's been there for 3 years? Why are my schools failing? Why are businesses leaving? Why am I struggling every month to pay the rent? These are the questions people have to ask. And sadly, until they ask those questions and make those demands, there won't be changes, because I'm sad to say this, political leadership in California now is not leadership. It's a group of people who primarily have their own personal idiosyncratic visions and agendas that really don't coincide whatsoever with what voters want.
Right.
Voters want the basics. They want they want schools and roads and bridges and water that works when they get out of bed in the morning. They don't want to have their lives completely politicized. and they want those politicians to be doing the jobs that they elected them for and that they're paying their salaries for.
So not to rename schools after Abraham Lincoln, right? They actually want actual results done, right? Or not take down statues as much. Be concerned about actually helping people's lives.
Yeah, there's been complete loss of what government is supposed to do. Government is, and again, it's, what I often tell people is, hey, you know what, if you hire a plumber to come to your house, they fix the drain. You aren't there to talk to them about politics and pay them for their opinion on politics, or ask them about, gosh, should we have a more utopian society? They're there to fix the drain, and the roofer's there to fix the roof, and the electrician's there to fix the outlet, and that's it. And government is there to make sure that public goods and services are provided at a reasonable quality and at a competitive and efficient price, and that's it. And that's it. They do the job of government. They're not there to tell us how we run our lives. They're there to make sure the schools function properly. And Ashton, you just brought up the idea about what's going on in San Francisco, where three members of the San Francisco Unified School Districts Board were recalled with overwhelming majority, 72 to 78%, because while San Francisco schools stayed closed, and again, ironically, what you pointed out, the people who are most vulnerable, oftentimes Black kids, Hispanic kids,
Right.
poor kids, whatever shape, size, or color, their parents don't have the money to hire tutors or to get online instruction. Those kids suffered enormously.
Absolutely.
San Francisco schools stayed closed. Parents were imploring them, please open the schools. Stay closed. And what did they spend their time doing?
Well, they're fighting white supremacy. It's more important.
Yeah, they thought, these people who were just recalled by kind of a 3-to-1 margin, they thought somehow in their mind, they thought they were elected. So the San Francisco School Board is elected. They thought they were elected to wipe out white supremacy and racism. And no, what they're there for is to make sure those Black kids and Hispanic kids and white kids and Asian kids, they all get a quality education. And they're getting, horrendous educations in some of those schools. Some of those schools, 95% of Black kids and Hispanic kids are not at proficiency or above.
Yep.
In math.
California is 45th on math and science of all the states.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And we think about, so when we think about the jobs of tomorrow, we think about the ability to use technology and mathematics and science and be able to think linearly and critically, which are broader implications of a mathematics background, a training background, where A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D. Can you carry out a complex set of instructions? Mathematics is about carrying out a complex set of instructions. These kids aren't going to have a chance. They're not going to have any chance at these jobs. They're doomed.
Right.
They're 9 or 10 years old and they are doomed. Unless there's some substantial interventions between now and when they finish high school.
And this is before the pandemic, of course. Right?
Yes, before the pandemic. Yes. And again, if you want to talk about racism, look at that San Francisco School Board. They are the ones who are in charge of the product. The product is miserably failing. And one of the school board members, who was, I think, maybe recalled by, I think, close to 80%, she quote, I don't have the exact quote, so I won't try to say it, but she made references to Asian American parents that they were practicing white supremacy.
Right. Yes.
And within certain Asian communities, education is incredibly highly valued. So those are kids who are sitting in front of Khan Academy at night and who are working with their parents on math on the weekends, and they've got their chemistry sets out. And this is called white supremacy. It is just, it's really unforgivable because these are children. These are the lives of children that we are damaging. And I'm glad that San Francisco voters are starting to wake up. the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and I really hope that San Francisco continues on this path because this is so destructive.
I hope so. I hope it's not a blimp. And the seems like the tent of white supremacy is getting larger by the day. Jews are white supremacists. Larry Elder's a white supremacist. Asian concerned parents are white supremacists. On Twitter today, by the way, I think it was like the Progressive Democrats handler of California blamed it on white supremacy as usual, which is just, I mean, asinine, especially a place like San Francisco. I don't see many white supremacists there. I want to get back to the issue of housing though, because that we sort of glossed over that, and I think it's a very interesting issue. So I grew up in the 1990s. California was still actually relatively affordable back then. Some of those places that were selling for a couple 100,000, 400,000 are now you're looking at, like I said, 1.5 million, 1.8 million. It's interesting that a lot of these places where progressives run, the housing tends to be more unaffordable, right? I don't know what is progressive about that. So whether you're looking at Hawaii or places in New York or Connecticut, and you mentioned something as well, Lee, about this idea that, oh, well, it's just like this. I've heard this a few times too. It's like, oh, it's just a sunshine tax. It's like, well, there doesn't have to be a sunshine tax. There's Florida that doesn't even charge personal income tax on the state level. Washington state is now a liberal state, still doesn't charge income tax. Oregon doesn't charge sales tax. And there are plenty of nice places around the world where they're paying a fraction of the taxes that you do in California. So it doesn't have to be this way. So what is it? What changed? Obviously, some of it was, I'm sure, population increase and people moving here with the whole Silicon Valley boom and all that. But what was led to such insane housing prices, and why have progressives been okay with that?
Yeah. So Ashton, you bring up, there's you make two really good points I'd like to build off of, and one is a point that that's out there in the ether that flies under the fog, and that people just aren't aware of, which is I'll start telling you the following story. You take someone like Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, lives in San Francisco, and he also has a home in Silicon Valley, and probably lives a lot of homes. I don't know how many billions of dollars he is worth. I know he's belongs to the Democratic Party. I don't mean to make this partisan, but when you ask what is progressive about keeping home prices high, well, you look at someone like Mark Zuckerberg, and then you look at, let's say, an immigrant family in the Central Valley. Who may also be members of the Democratic Party, and you ask, what does that immigrant family and Mark Zuckerberg have in common? Zero. They have literally nothing in common. Okay, and so this is the point that flies under the radar, which is they're a group of very influential, extremely wealthy, politically very liberal people in California, who are all for making California and California cities, which you might call sanctuary cities, who are wonderfully appreciative and supportive of California taking the lead on climate change and green energy, even if it drives up the cost of housing enormously. So right now, when you construct a new house in California, by law, it has to have solar panels. Okay, there is an exemption if you have a lot of shade trees on your house and the sun just can't break through. But
Every new house?
Every new home now has to be built with solar panels.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There are some exemptions, but for the most part, this took place. I think the law took effect in January 2020, I believe. And not just solar panels, but also incredibly energy efficient glass. So double pane or triple pane glass, super energy efficient appliances, all of which developers have told me will raise the price of the average California home potentially by $40,000 to $50,000.
Oh, wow.
And so you're just really adding insult to injury to people who already can't afford housing, and now saying, hey, you know what? I am not me personally, but again, if we think about this group of people, very political liberal, very wealthy, very successful, who are saying, yes, we're for green energy, we're for fighting climate change, we're with you. They don't mind tacking those costs on everyone else because they feel good to know that their home state is out in front and taking the charge on climate change, even if it really punishes that immigrant family in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley because they already can't afford a home, much less afford a home
Right.
with the most energy efficient insulation and glass in a
Mhm.
state that has one of the mildest climates in the world.
Right.
So you've got this fundamental disconnect between the personal agendas of progressives
Mhm.
and everyone else. And when it comes down to asking, this same group of people, hey, how about a low income 15-story apartment building right across the street from you?
Mhm.
Well, you know what they're going to say.
Right.
Not in my backyard, and
Mhm.
they're going to fight it tooth and nail. In fact,
Mhm.
there was this really amusing story about 2 3 weeks ago. There's a small town in Silicon Valley called Woodside. Per capita income is among the highest in the country. Um, in terms of politics, only 15% are registered Republicans.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
one. Republicans are scarce in California, but
Yeah.
just 15%, really scarce in Woodside. Now, when you mention SB 9, SB 9, Senate Bill 9 was passed to try to increase housing supply in California.
Mhm.
And just as a little bit of a backstory, there have been bills every year trying to expand housing in California by essentially introducing multifamily homes
Mhm.
into neighborhoods that had been zoned as single family
Right. So
homes.
SB 9 allows you to have an ADU essentially to build an accessory dwelling units on your home. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it allows for an accessory dwelling unit. Some people call them granny flats.
Mhm.
It also allows for construction of up to four individual
Right.
living situations. So, for example, you could have two duplexes or a fourplex.
Mhm.
And so to get that through, there were all sorts of exemptions written into SB 9. So at the end of the day, the Turner Real Estate Research Center at UC Berkeley that does a really nice job. They have a lot of interesting reports they produce. They came out and said, you know what, SB 9 is not really going to move the needle. One reason being that there's a lot of exemptions, and ironically, what was built into SB 9 is the idea, and this is really very subversive. If you're a housing advocate, if you're a housing
Mhm.
building advocate, then what I'm going to tell you right now is incredibly subversive. Um, it was advertised that, well, if this bill passes, corporations are going to come in and buy out homes and turn that home into a fourplex. So corporations aren't allowed to come in and buy that home and turn it into a
Right.
fourplex. It's got to be owner occupied.
Mm.
And so you can put up your duplex or fourplex if you want, but guess what? You've got to own that home outright.
Mm.
If you don't, your mortgage covenant will not allow you to do that. It simply won't allow you to do that. So
So if you have a mortgage
the
on your
idea,
home, you can't uh, make
you
use of
can't.
this.
No, I mean that mortgage is on a single family home. You can do a remodel,
Mhm.
but the idea that you would have to go back to the bank and say, hey, here's what I'm going to do, because they are the stakeholder in your decision to buy that single family home.
Mm.
Um, it's you have to own the land outright, or perhaps you could go negotiate with the
Wow.
bank or whoever owns the mortgage. Okay, so when I say subversive, how many people
Right.
outright own their
Yeah.
homes in California?
Right.
I mean, I've got a big mortgage on my
Mhm.
home. And so getting back to Woodside, what Woodside did is that, again, very political liberal, very wealthy, 1 acre lots, big rambling homes, bucolic lifestyle. That's what they wanted.
Mhm.
They don't want fourplexes. They don't want duplexes. They don't want increased density. So guess what they did? They applied for Woodside to be a natural habitat
Oh
for an
God.
endangered species, the California mountain lion. And it made me laugh because I thought, I mean, I know people who live in Woodside,
Mhm.
and I know that Woodside is sort of a haven for dogs because I've visited friends there. And then you see like lots of these little dogs. You go to cafes or
Mhm.
restaurants, and there's lots of these little dogs. And my dog, who unfortunately you heard earlier, he's a little dog. And I thought, since when do the owners of 8-pound Pomeranians and 6-pound toy poodles, since when are they the friend of the California mountain
Right.
lion? But, so this is the extent to which they wanted to go to prevent building in their area.
It's unbelievable.
So yeah, yeah. So again, progressive politicians, very wealthy progressive political backers, they aren't necessarily, more often than not, they're not the friends of those people who are really struggling to live in California.
Yeah,
Not even close.
that tends to be the theme, and they create this veneer that they somehow care about middle and working people, but everything they do basically stands in opposition to them, makes their lives even harder. And that's why they're moving to evil places like Texas, where that same family who's making, well, I think in San Francisco, if your family before making 120,000, you are basically eligible for government benefits because that's making nothing in San Francisco, right? All your money's going out the drain, especially with
Yes.
a 10% income tax. So, and then they could go to a
Yeah.
place like Texas. I was just in Austin a couple of weeks ago, and Austin's the most expensive city in Texas, and even there you can find something for like 450, 500,000, like a good house in a decent neighborhood, good neighborhood.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. And there's a county in Texas. I can't recall where it was, but there's a county in Texas that at one time had been 95. It was primarily Hispanic families living in that county. At one time, it had been 95% registered Democrat. It's now
Hmm.
60% registered Republican. And
Right.
I'm not trying to be partisan about this. I'm
Yeah.
I'm a political independent.
Right.
But at the end of the day, people want their political leaders to deliver a
Hmm.
product and not just talk about it. And what they, at least in California, the political product that's being developed is the one that caters to, for lack of a better name, the Mark Zuckerbergs
Right. The progressive
of
elite.
California,
Hmm.
the elite,
Yep.
who don't mind having home prices go up because we're all in for climate change,
Hmm. Hmm.
who don't mind putting the price of that on the backs of incredibly poor people,
Right.
who are going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that they don't have a lot of poor people living down the street from them.
Hmm.
And when you think about, kind of who has your back, as I mentioned, I'm a political independent, but I was an advisor for three of the California gubernatorial recall candidates. Larry Elder is one,
Hmm.
and Caitlyn Jenner is another, and Kevin Faulkner was another. And Larry ended up getting the most traction of any of those folks. And when you mentioned that, in the press, and the LA Times called him the black face of white supremacy, I just thought this is, I just thought, is this what we've become
It's like a
as a
Babylon Bee
society?
article. Yeah.
Is this what we've become?
No.
And and I've known Larry for a long, long time. I appear on his radio show, 4 to 6 times a year. Um, and what California would have gotten with him as a governor is someone who wouldn't have imposed his own political issues on everyone else.
Hmm.
Now, he was pilloried about his personal feelings about abortion versus pro-choice. And he told me after the election, he said, "Lee, how can people be worried that I'm gonna somehow come into a state of 40 million people and say my major priority is
Right.
to make abortion harder
Yeah.
to get in
Yeah. Yeah.
California?" He says,
Yeah.
"No, I'm going to make sure, when you turn on the faucet, water's going to come out and the schools work
Hmm.
and there's not potholes in the roads and then it doesn't cost
Hmm.
$500,000 to build a low-income housing unit. That's what I'm going to try
Right.
to do." And yet, in the last week or two before the election, the recall election, I have to say the Democratic Party was genius in terms of the strategy they came up with. All they didn't talk about Newsom's accomplishments. They said Gavin's fighting for it, he's fighting for
Hmm.
climate change, and he's taking the lead on dealing with the pandemic, and etc. But they went after Larry Elder.
Right.
Uh, Ad after ad after ad. Gavin had tens of $1 millions in a political war chest that he could just throw out at that. He had Barack Obama to make
All the Netflix money.
commercials about,
Hmm.
and um, and so now we sort of ask, okay, well, yeah, here we are sitting
Hmm.
here, the same potholes in the road, the same underperforming schools. It costs an arm and a leg to live here. Taxes are still very high. Businesses are leaving. My friends are leaving. Okay, what's next?
Right.
And what's next is going to be more of the same.
Right. And I respect that you don't want to make it into a partisan issue. Unfortunately, largely due to the fact that there's now a disassociation, as we're discussing, like between the progressive left, or the people who actually control the shots in the Democratic Party, particularly in California, which is often precursor to the rest of the country, and we're seeing in the rest of the country, and the traditional pro-labor left. So when we, as you mentioned in your corollary in the beginning with Pat Brown, right, the Democratic Party used to be the pro-labor party, and that was the sort of Democratic Party that I liked to a certain extent as well. I mean, even if I didn't agree with them on certain things, maybe 30% of the time, 40% of the time I did. And you see it right now with this whole like truckers thing in Canada, and the people who claim to have always been for the working people are now calling these people Nazis, and they're vehemently against truckers protesting, right? The working class, as blue collar as it gets, right? And you see this sort of disconnect, and then you see it with these other things that we're discussing as well, where it's labor and actual sort of wages and the traditional sort of blue collar working sorts of issues, the union issues, right? Like the are sort of pushed aside for some of these luxury beliefs, right? These niche issues like transgenderism or CRT, or even Gavin Newsom announced recently that like California will be an abortion sanctuary, and they'll pay for people to come here and have an abortion. It's like, okay, fine, but like that's really your priority while everything else is going to shit. And I didn't even know what you told me about the SB9, and that was something where I completely agreed, and that was something that Democrats were instrumental in pushing. I didn't know about these exemptions. I mean, that pretty much defeats the whole purpose of it if you have to own the land, and we're talking about $1.5 million homes, on average in some of these cities. So that kind of is at the heart of the problem. And you mentioned this Woodside place, right? So the 10 biggest zip codes and the 10 wealthiest zip codes in the country are all Democratic, right? So you do see this interesting sort of shift. And it's unfortunate because we need, both parties to sort of have in mind, small businesses and working class people rather than these sort of niche issues. Real quick on the housing issue, CEQA, that makes things very expensive as well. Can you sort of go through what that is briefly?
Sure. So, California Environmental Quality Act. So the acronym has become CEQA, CEQA, and was signed into law in, I believe, 1970 by then Governor Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican who was a fierce advocate for the environment. Again, if you want to think about elitism, Reagan was a wealthy guy. He had a huge ranch. He loved to go horseback riding in the California wilderness. He understood that there should be environmental protection. We just can't run roughshod over it. Fair enough. Mm-hmm. The law wasn't written very well. One aspect with the law wasn't written well is that CEQA requires that any development, now any development means any development, needs to make sure that there's not damage to the environment. Well, what development doesn't do damage to the environment? I mean, by construction, we're going to put up a building, we're going to take out some chaparral. So what should have been written into that law is some type of cost benefit calculus, which is, hey, you know what, we're going to build new housing, this has benefits. But the most important lesson in economics is that there's trade-offs. Nothing comes for free. And we have the analytical ability to value these trade-offs. So that should have been part of the law. I and some other economists continued to try to implore the state legislators to modify the law. And there are some in the Democratic Party, including Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, who are very, very favorable towards that. Pat Brown's son, Jerry Brown, sort of went back and forth on this, but towards the end of his second term, he said, we just can't continue to have CEQA the way it is. It is just being used to stop development or to threaten or use lawsuits to lever goodies from the outcome of development for special interest groups. So I'll give you just a quick example of how CEQA can drive up costs enormously. There's near Valencia, which I think is where Magic Mountain theme park is, right. not too far from there. And it's kind of 35, 40 miles outside of LA, roughly speaking, so possibly called the bedroom community. Back in 1994, a planned community for 60,000 people was created, and the idea people behind this submitted plans for this new 60,000 person planned community. Okay, and is out in wide open country, formerly agricultural land, but acres and acres of just trees and grasslands and chaparral and brush. And that was in 1994. The final plans for this community were finally I's dotted and T's crossed, I believe, in 2018. 24 years. 24 years. Still not one house has been built.
Wow.
I mean, it's in the process. And during this time, I think the original developers filed bankruptcy. It's gone through different, it's gone through so many names.
That's almost as old as me.
All of them, there were many CEQA lawsuits, and one of the real challenges to CEQA is that you can file the same lawsuit again and again.
Are you kidding me?
No. And if you want to know the last lawsuit that was finally settled, an environmental outfit who I believe is headquartered just outside of Phoenix. So not even, I think they have an office in California, but they filed a lawsuit, an environmental lawsuit, and they didn't decide to settle that lawsuit or drop it until the developer agreed to put in 20,000 electric car charging ports.
Oh my God.
Okay, now think about the numbers. This is a city this was going to be a planned community for 60,000 people. I think now it's probably down to 45 or 50,000 people.
Right.
In California, there's about one car per 3 people.
Right.
Okay, so that's going to be about 15,000 cars. About 2% of our car stock is electric. So 2% of 15,000 cars is what, 300 cars? So in what calculation does 20,000 electric car charging ports make sense for a community that's going to have about 300 Teslas? So this is the kind of insanity that's, this, and if you think about the incentives and the interests of those who are filing these lawsuits versus people living in California and, want to live in one of those homes that's now 25 years delayed. Well, the environmental group benefits because they get to go to their well-heeled donors and say, hey, look what I did. I saved, whatever butterfly was out there, and it's going to be green, and there's all these electric car charging ports. Give me more donations so I can continue doing the Lord's work.
Right.
And meanwhile, who's paying the cost? And when you mention,
litigation costs,
who's really suffering in California, the median person who's really suffering in California is the Hispanic family, who tends not really, even though there are Hispanic political leaders in the state, and for the most part, I don't think they really have their constituents' interests at heart. And I know this might take us a little bit far afield, but the election of President Trump in 2016 was just a boon for the Democratic Party in California because you always got to have a boogeyman you could point to. And so the lightning rod was always Donald Trump. If you looked at how many lawsuits Xavier Becerra filed as California Attorney General against Trump, if you look at the rallying cry for a lot of progressives, it was about Donald Trump. Well, now Trump is gone.
Right.
So the alternative has been to paint Larry Elder as another Donald Trump. And the Republican Party has got, if they're going to become politically viable in the state, and I think, no matter who you are, no matter, if you're an independent, Democrat, Republican, you want to have political competition.
Of course.
You don't want a one-party state. You don't want all Democrats, you don't want all Republicans.
Absolutely.
You want to have the best ideas come out, and you want those people to work cohesively. Bill Clinton worked with Newt Gingrich. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan deals together. The idea of a politician has totally changed. Back in the day, like when I was a kid, a politician meant you did a deal. And a skilled politician is one who did a deal that everybody got something out of. And you could say, yeah, they represented my interests really well. We didn't get everything, but you can't get everything when you're doing the deal. everybody's got to feel like they get some out of this. Today, a politician is somebody that has a TikTok account, that has Snapchat and
Yeah.
Instagram and Facebook, and says, I'm fighting against Donald Trump. Or on the other side, I'm fighting against the crazy wokes.
Right.
Political leaders are here to kind of bring people together
Mhm.
by doing
And to
deals.
actually do the legislation, right? The hand wringing and the legislation, the actual work, not streaming
Yeah,
on Twitch.
yeah,
The CEQA
yeah.
thing is really pernicious, especially, you can think, well, if I'm a somebody who benefits in some way from having electric charge ports installed, maybe I supply them with the materials, maybe my wife has ownership interest in these things, maybe I supply some of the materials to Tesla or whatever, then I can just file the CEQA lawsuit and then get them to compromise on this issue, and then here's another boon to my business, right? So you have all sorts of pernicious consequences that could result from this. All sorts of, you brought up a sort of philanthropic reason why somebody would do that. But there's business reasons as well, right? That you can destroy somebody who's trying to build housing for people and benefit from it financially, which is a whole different, can of worms. Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in terms of CEQA, another modification to CEQA that I've advocated for, and that many others have advocated for, is that there be transparency in the groups who are filing lawsuits against a project. So more often than not, you will see a lawsuit filed on behalf of, for example, Friends of the River or Friends of the Wilderness or Rancho Cucamonga Friends for the whatever butterfly. And they sound like environmental groups, but more often than not, these groups have just popped up. They have no track record whatsoever. They have no track record whatsoever of environmental advocacy in any way, shape, or form. And these are groups that pop up with environmental aims, who might be a labor union who wants to make sure that their workers get hired on a project, might be a community action committee who notes that a neighborhood park is in disrepair because local government hasn't funded maintenance and expenditures, and they want the developer to pay for that local park to be redone. So another, what I think is totally common sense modification to CEQA is that anybody filing a lawsuit, you've got to say who you are and why you're doing this, because it's supposed to be for the environment. And there was a study done a while back by a law firm that does a lot of work in terms of environmental lawsuits. And they went through, hundreds of CEQA-based lawsuits. And what they found is most of the time, these lawsuits have nothing at all to do with the environment. These are all special interest type things.
That makes sense. And let's transition for a second to the homelessness issue, which is, 50% of homeless people in this country live in California, despite California having 12% of the population. This is, you want to talk about the changes in California, the 90s, not that long ago, right? When I was growing up, you had homelessness pretty much segregated in places like Skid Row or downtown, some in Santa Monica, maybe on the beach. And today it's equal opportunity, right? It's everywhere. It's all the suburbs. It's scattered all across the county in wealthy areas and middle class areas, and still become astronomically bigger in the poor areas. What is California doing wrong in terms of the homelessness issue?
Well, my Hoover column this week, it's sorry to be a self-promoter, but if people are interested, I write this column every week called California on Your Mind on the Hoover Institution, on the Hoover Institution website. And my column this week was exactly about homelessness, because what we found is, again, Governor Newsom was talking about, hey, we spent $13 billion on homelessness. Isn't this great? The problem got worse. How can that be great? And Republicans who are essentially pretty much frozen out of state politics because there are supermajorities in both the Senate and the Assembly.
Right.
They wrote a letter to Governor Newsom asking for a special legislative session about homelessness. They said it's at epic proportions. This is a crisis. Look at the streets of San Francisco. There's a book now on the bestseller list by a fellow named Michael Schellenberger called San Francisco. And he writes
Hmm.
about economic policies there and social policies and the idea of how San Francisco has tacitly not only accepted drug use, but really has facilitated drug use by providing um, injection kits and snorting kits, and even to kids, even to teenagers. Um, and it is simply, it's not in anyone's best interest, including those people whose lives are just out of control. And they have, they're addicts or they have severe substance abuse issues. Um, and yet we continue to throw money at that problem. Um, and what we're discovering now is that, chronic homelessness is really all about mental health, emotional issues, or physical health, drug abuse issues, and we've really kind of swept that under the rug. Um, Senator Patricia Bates, who's in Laguna Niguel, I spoke to her about a week or 2 weeks ago, after she and her colleagues sent this letter to Newsom, and saying, we need to have better accountability and we really need to address this issue of mental health and drug abuse. And she pointed out that psychiatric inpatient capacity in California per person is among the lowest in the United States, despite the fact California spends tens of billions of dollars on homelessness every year. Um, Psychiatric and addiction health providers are among the lowest in the country on a per capita basis. So her point is, and she is a former social worker, so she's seen this. She has seen this stuff up close and personal. She said, these are where we can make investments. We need to get these people off the streets and into hospitals, but first we need to build the beds and build the capacity and have health professionals here who can work with these people. Totally common sense, right? Well, that's not what's happening. She also had the idea, which is a great idea, said, you know what? There are groups, demographic groups, where we know that their risk of becoming homeless is very high. For example, veterans. Veterans have a very, very high chance of becoming homeless. Kids from a foster child background have a very, very high risk of becoming homeless. So her point was, hey, we can target these groups. We can provide support to them in counseling, including health support, emotional support, guidance before this happens to them. So let's make investments in these areas. Sounds totally like common sense. So why not have these ideas be part of the conversation? So the Republicans said, let's have a special legislative session so we can talk about all of the facets of what we need to do to make a dent in this problem. So thus far, the official word from Sacramento has been just pure silence. Newsom hasn't even responded to it. And I think privately he has called it political grandstanding. And just imagine the people who are living in these cities where you see displays of just human misery and sadness playing out in the
Right.
streets every day. And
Hmm.
yeah, and so again, you
You
think
can't take your
about,
children
well,
outside either.
you can't take the children's side. Well, one of my closest friends. We've been friends, like since we were eighth or ninth grade. He lives in San Carlos, California, probably about 10 miles between Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And he took his daughter for lunch to their favorite restaurant in San Francisco. They drive up there. They park in a parking structure. The cost something like $20 or $25 for maybe the 2 hours they were there.
Right.
They walk out of the parking structure to walk the 2 blocks to the restaurant. They walk past three people passed out on the ground. They walked past someone who was defecating on the sidewalk. They were propositioned if they wanted to buy drugs twice. They
Oh
saw
my
people
God.
shooting up, and this isn't just a 2 block. This isn't a 2 block area. So again,
Right.
This is the outcome of what the
Hmm.
progressive vision has become.
Would mandatory institutionalization of some of these individuals who clearly have psychiatric issues, slash making the addicts either forcing them to maybe get rehab, or end up or go to jail, for example, having those two as your options. This is what they do I was in Malaysia last year, no, a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic. There's no homelessness there, and some other states do something like this. Would that sort of be the solution to putting a dent in this problem?
That's kind of the $64 question right there, because it boils down to issues such as civil rights and personal rights and
Right.
constitutional rights. And San Francisco has completely ignored laws such as vagrancy laws, and has ignored laws regarding the illegality of using methamphetamine or fentanyl or heroin. They just turned their backs on that. So what is so big picture, what's the answer? We don't want people defecating on the street and shooting drugs to the point where they're killing themselves, or they're going into an opioid coma and they have to be injected with anti-opioid drugs to bring them back from the dead. That simply is not acceptable. I mean, I don't think anybody in society would ever say, yeah, that's okay. So now, what do you do about that? Well, one possibility is you have to bring family into the situation if family is willing to be part of that, or if the person does have family.
Right.
Portugal, I believe in Portugal, drug use is very lax, or drug
Hmm.
regulations are very lax, but you don't get to use them out in the street. You don't get to
Right.
camp out on sidewalks.
Yeah.
You can't defecate on the street.
Portugal uses an example oftentimes, and then they forget the other part, which is how they make it work, is that they're very strict when it comes to actually using your drug use outside and destroying the city. You don't have, public parks in Portugal overrun by drug addicts and
No,
syringes.
that's exactly right. So if you choose to use drugs, you
Hmm.
can't be doing it on the streets.
Hmm.
So you want to take care of yourself, be part of the community, and use drugs. Maybe that's something you can deal with. But if you can't deal with it, then you have to go get treatment. So yes, this would probably require modifying some of the laws in which a person is taken into institutional custody.
Hmm.
And there's enormous discussions, arguments going back and forth about the deinstitutionalization of these people. That's 40 to 50 years now in the review. So this has been going on 40, 50 years.
Hmm.
So no easy answers, but we simply we can't have people living on the streets using drugs like they have. If they can't get it together, then I'm in favor of them going into treatment. Even if they say, you know what, I prefer selling fentanyl on the street corner and get my $600 a month from the city of San Francisco and just kind of being me. Even if they prefer that, that's unacceptable. So I think that has to happen, but
Yeah.
it probably will take some legal reforms involved with that.
I think Portugal has a pretty decent solution for it that we could probably learn a bit from. Maybe not incorporating the exact same thing, but similar. And it's just funny, you talk about San Francisco, the sorts of things that they're willing to actually legislate or be aggressive about, and the things they aren't, like the lifestyle things that destroy local communities. And I think you mentioned one of your columns, San Francisco now has a higher per capita crime rate than Compton. Is that right?
Yes, in terms of overall crime, it is higher than Compton, which was, of course,
Unbelievable.
which was the capital of cocaine distribution, and people remember, the Crips and the Bloods,
Right,
and
right.
essentially drug gangs of South Central LA. That is where it
Hmm.
was going on. But
Okay,
now it's San Francisco. I have a one of my PhD students. She's from Australia. She and her boyfriend were in San Francisco, just playing tourist. They parked their car and they locked it, and they came back an hour
hmm
later. Sure enough, smash and grab.
hmm
They lost everything that was in the car. They lost their laptops and they lost their clothes. And this is unacceptable. This just can't continue.
Right.
And I think we're starting to see that with San Francisco voters. We saw the
Hmm.
recall of the people on the school board, and San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin,
Hmm.
who would describe himself as progressive, and who has not prosecuted a lot of these crimes, who believes that, at least in terms of his actions, looks like he believes in accepting drug use for what it is. He is being recalled, so he
Right.
will face a recall
He's one of the
election.
most dangerous officials in public life. Like, it is truly unfathomable. the sorts of things that he's been able to institute. By the way, being against the families of victims even, and I mean you can just pull up so many different instances where he doesn't people who actually. There's one instance in particular I read about a couple of months ago where a gang member killed another gang member, and he was basically let off the hook. And Joseph didn't press charges. It's like the Joker, but even more sinister, without any of the charisma. And with regards to the San Francisco thing as well, I was reading about the right before we came on about this individual who spent like a couple $100,000 trying to open up an ice cream store in San Francisco. I'm sure you probably heard of this one, and he couldn't do it. He's $200,000 down the drain, but because of the complexity of all the permits and the ability for other people to protest it, and I think there were some environmental implications, he couldn't even open up an ice cream store in an impoverished area. This guy was an immigrant, of course. So it just gets back to these misplaced priorities. What do you think are the couple biggest regulations or couple biggest policy mistakes that can be fixed with legislation that would make an impact on California being more economically viable, being more of an opportunity place again, being improving the quality of life of everyday people? What strikes your mind or comes to your mind in terms of the 2 or 3 worst regulations or policies that are currently enacted in California?
Well, we spoke about California Environmental Quality Act, and that has now been that is really being abused in so many ways. So it is high time that we reform the California Environmental Quality Act, particularly as it relates to economic development and social development. We should reverse Assembly Bill 5, which essentially prohibits a person from working as an independent contractor. And when you mentioned unions before, AB 5 essentially says that most people now who used to be able to work as independent contractors, now they have to work as a formal employee of the business. And why was that? Well, unions wanted more people to unionize, to get into collective bargaining situations and get their union pay. Interestingly, in California, unions brought in nearly $1 trillion in revenue in 2021. So when you think about a political war chest,
Wow.
Keep that in mind. So CEQA and AB 5, I think, have been incredibly destructive. We really need, I think, better politicians who understand that their job is to fix the normal processes the governments are involved in. Are are the roads in good repair? Do the schools work? Is there water in the pipes? Or are we just going to have, are we going to be in trouble every time when it doesn't rain? Are we going to have a regulatory base that chases businesses out, a tax base that chases businesses out? We need better politicians, and we need voters to hold politicians accountable. It's been far too long that politicians have been able to say, pat people on the back and say, "Hey, I'm there for you. I'm doing the Lord's work, and I'm fighting against Trump every chance we get." Well, Trump's gone, and we can't continue to call other Republicans Trump. So I've suggested, in the column I wrote this week, I suggested that I think there probably should be a law that requires an independent auditing agency to rank every legislator on the basis of what they did to contain costs and increase efficiency and reduce waste in government, and send that out to every voter. But really, it begins with people. They've got to demand more. They have to demand more and better of their elected officials. And until they do, we're just going to keep going down the road we're on right now. Sad to say.
Well, let's hope they do, because this state, it would be a real travesty if we continue to let it go down the way that other former prosperous places in this country have gone down. Notably Detroit, right? Chicago. No one even talks about Chicago anymore unless it's a violent incident.
Yeah.
That used to be 1A and 1B, Chicago, New York, and now no one even talks about Chicago anymore. And there's no guarantee that California will achieve its success. It has amazing weather, but we can't just let this state just go to hell without. And people
No,
have
because
to.
and when as we see with places like Detroit and Dearborn, Dayton, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, it's much better. Even if the decline is substantial, you want to catch it before it hits rock bottom,
Right.
because you see just how hard it is to bring back these cities when most of the productive young people have left, and that's really the inkling the politicians need to be paying attention to, which is, hey, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, they're leaving. We can't sustain a state on the basis of a bunch of relatively poorly paid immigrants,
Right.
and a handful of aging, highly elite, highly wealthy progressives.
Feudalism's not
That's
good.
just going to work.
We don't want to live in the feudalist state. Absolutely. Lee Ohanian, thank you so much for being with me. Can you remind the listeners and viewers where they can find your great works and writings?
Yeah, if go to www.hoover.org, hoover.org, do a search for my name. Even if you just put in Lee, you'll find my writings. And if people have questions, I'd be happy to address them via email.
Excellent.
They can find that. They can find my contact info there too.
And we'll put some of that in the show notes. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thanks for your interest. I enjoyed our conversation.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.